again for the third of three discussions and lectures by Ignacio. Appreciate you all coming today and joining the conversation, as well as kind of getting to hear the different themes as they've evolved and emerged over the past few weeks. So there's some new faces, so again, welcome. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ignacio. Just one side note is that we are recording, so just to give, just want to make sure folks feel okay and comfortable with that. And it's primarily going to be used for Ignacio's purposes, just in terms of him reviewing the lecture and being able to kind of build upon it in the future. So with that, my hat's off to Ignacio, and thanks so much.
Thank you, Michael, and good afternoon, everyone, and all the new faces. Like Michael said, my name is Ignacio Darnaud, and I'm really grateful once again to the Los Angeles LGBT Center for giving me the opportunity to give these three lectures. If you've been to my previous ones, in the first one, I spoke about how queer artists use classical, mythological, and religious images as a cover-up to portray homoerotic images. Last week, I spoke about the double lives of iconic gay artists. And today, I'm going to talk about something which I find fascinating, is how queer artists portray homoerotic images hiding in plain sight in iconic works of art. And in case you were not here from my previous talks, to give you a little bit of a sense of my background, I've been developing a documentary series about the impact of gay artists in history called Hiding in Plain Sight, Breaking the Gay Code in Art. And my research is the basis for these lectures. And before we start, you don't need to worry about the text in the slides because I'm going to be incorporating that into my lecture. Please make sure that you mute your microphones, and if you have any questions, leave them for the end because there will be a Q&A. So in my research, I've uncovered that gay artists have revolutionized art and transformed mainstream culture throughout history. And they have done that in spite of a very daunting challenge. So because homosexuality has been prosecuted since the 4th century, gay artists always face a dilemma. Should I be in the closet or should I be out with my art and my life, and in doing so risk critical and commercial rejection and maybe even prosecution? So this is why many gay artists couldn't express themselves openly in the work, and what they did is they either hid homoerotic images in plain sight or they used secret gay codes to express their same-sex desires. So why did they do that? Well, very simple, because this is the only way they could get away with it, to express taboos in their work in a way that it was only obvious to those in the know without alienating the general audience and consequently without being prosecuted. And the way I define homoerotic, once again, is an image that is not overtly sexual, but is very appealing to the gay community in a subtle or not so subtle way. And I like this quote from The Little Prince that says, "What is essential is invisible to the eye," because that's really what my talk is about today. But before I talk about codes in art, I feel it's really relevant to talk about how gay men and women have used codes in their daily lives in societies where they couldn't be open. And today I have 3 examples for you. For instance, in their clothing. Here we have what was called in the 70s and 80s the hanky code that gave sexual meanings to specific items such as keys, ties, handkerchiefs, etc., depending on the color and where you wore them. The second example is how writers also use codes to express their feelings before the 1969 Stonewall Revolution. This is an image of Gentleman Jack, which is a series of HBO that talks about the life of the diarist Anne Lister. And she wrote over 1 million words in code in her diaries to describe her lesbian relationships. And the last thing I want to talk about is how in England, since the 19th century, all the way until 1967, when homosexuality was decriminalized, gay men used polari, a secret coded language which allowed them to speak privately in public, and in doing so, avoid being caught by undercover policemen, which were everywhere. So now that we know how codes existed in life, it's no surprise that they also exist in art. And today I'm going to focus on two different concealing tactics used by queer artists. They either hid queer imagery hiding in plain sight, like this beautiful scene in a mural in Florence by Bronzino, or they use secret gay codes in their work, like this piece by Jasper Jones that I'm going to be talking about later today. And I explain the reasons why they do it. This is the only way they could be open in a way that they could express themselves without being punished for it. And it's interesting how as codes change in life, they also change in art. And I believe I want to spread the word about these codes because it's very important that they don't get lost, because that would erase gay history from our collective memory. And we can't let that to happen. So in my research, what I've uncovered is that artists portray queer imagery hiding in plain sight in many different ways. And I have here 5 different examples or series of examples to talk about, which I think you're going to find fascinating, I hope, is queer imagery hiding in plain sight inside religious images, in images of bathers and wrestlers, in patriotic images, in Orientalist and surreal images, and in gender fluid images and public murals. So let's talk about inside religious images. So you may remember that in a previous lecture, I spoke how Luca Signorelli created murals in Orvieto, which were hugely influential for Michelangelo and the Sistine Chapel. So in this painting by Signorelli from 1507 called Madonna and Child, Signorelli hides in plain sight, for no particular reason, this very suggestive image of 3 semi-nude young men. Michelangelo uses the same tactic. In one of his most famous paintings, Doni Tondo, he shows 5 naked young men playing in the background, completely indifferent to the Holy Family, which according to many historians was just a pretext, an excuse for Michelangelo to expose what he really cared for, male beauty. And in another painting by Michelangelo called what is so-called now Manchester Madonna, he shows 2 androgynous angels caught in plain sight in an intimate moment. So that's that for religious images. So now let's talk about bathers and wrestlers. So you may know Albert Dürer, who is one of history's most important artists. And if you know him, you probably recognize the self-portrait. But he also portrayed himself in a very provocative manner for his time. So to tell you a little bit about Dürer, he was openly misogynistic, but he lived in Germany at a time when, in the Middle Ages, where artists were forced to get married to achieve social status. So he had an arranged and very unhappy marriage. And right after the wedding, he moved on his own to Italy. So why don't you look at this woodcut called the bathhouse, which is one of his most famous images, to see if anything catches your attention before I get into it. So this woodcut, yes. So this woodcut is a very unusual image of a traditional bathhouse, which is where men and women enjoy their services. And it is unusual because A, it shows naked men in public during a time of absolute repression in a city, Nuremberg, where clothing was mandatory and it was regulated down to the number of pearls that you could have, women could have on their garments. Also, it shows public figures. These 2 nude men in the forefront are 2 brothers of one of the ruling families in Nuremberg. But let's get now into the details. So this etching, or woodcut, I'm sorry, is full of homoerotic images that are waiting to be discovered. Here we see Dürer looking very lovingly at his teacher, while he's leaning next to a very provocatively shaped faucet. And the portrait of his master or his teacher includes a mysterious bearded face in his body right over a very risque underwear, which is directly close to a male figure. But there's more. This one of the two brothers, Stephen Baumgartner, who was Dürer's reputed lover, holds a carnation, a code used by gay men. And the tree behind Dürer's teacher, evokes a male nude upside down. So literally, this image is full of homoerotic images that Dürer got away with because he hid them in plain sight. But I want to talk to you about a seminal piece of art. This is a drawing by Michelangelo called the Battle of Cascina. So the Battle of Cascina was fought in 1364 between the cities of Florence and Pisa. And Michelangelo, instead of doing what any other artist would have done, which is showing a heroic image of the triumph of Florence, instead, he depicts the moment when the Florentine soldiers were caught unaware while they were bathing naked at the river Arno in Florence. So Michelangelo chose this image for a very particular reason, because it allowed him to show his favorite topic, the nude male figure in many postures and the idea of male bonding. So Michelangelo, by him connecting the ideas of virility, patriotism, and this idea that I explained from the classical period of idealized naked male bodies as a symbol of virtue, then altogether, what he does is Michelangelo gives us permission to stare at these men's bodies as long as we want, without being worried about the consequences. And it is because of that since then, hundreds of artists have used this drawing as an alibi to portray homoerotic male bathers. And I'm going to show you an example that I find completely extraordinary. This painting by Domenico Cristi, called Bathers at San Niccolò from the year 1600, shows the Arno River in Florence, which was at the time one of the city's areas for gay encounters. And to give you a little bit of context for how homosexuality was in Florence in this period, the Florentine man usually started his sexual life around 14, but he usually didn't get married until he was around 30. So a great number of them took to sodomy. And in this period, a huge number of Florentine men were officially incriminated for engaging in homosexual activities at least once during their lifetimes. And this painting shows a scene from daily life and an idealized version of friendship or maybe love. Here in the foreground, we see a couple locked in an ardent gaze. Their hands are touching, and the city man is pointing at what it was a bathhouse at the time, perhaps where they would go after this encounter. So when this painting recently sold at an auction house for $750,000, it was described as the most important example of homoerotic art of the period, anticipating by 300 years the painting by Thomas Eakins, The Swimming Hole, which I'm going to be talking about later today. So the question that comes to me is, how did he get away with this? Because what was really extraordinary is that he did not use the excuse that his contemporaries use for homoerotic male nudes, which is a religious or a mythological image. What he did is that he used the excuse that his painting was inspired by Michelangelo's Battle of Cascina, look at how he's pointing like him, and the classical statue of the Belvedere torso. So these two classical codes, he uses classicism as a cover-up for homoeroticism, all the way in the year 1600. So it's interesting that up until the 19th century, only the female body was considered sexual. The general assumption was that all men were heterosexual and they wouldn't care about seeing each other naked. But as I've explained in the past, with the Oscar Wilde trials and the emergence of gay identity, this all changed, and then male nudes became taboo and suspect. So it's interesting how this beautiful painting by Frederic Basile, which is the first image of a homosocial seen in a contemporary setting in centuries. Originally, when he, in the sketches, you see that they were all nude. But I think he soon realized that that would have been problematic. So he added bathing suits, and he made the bather on the left pose like a very famous painting of Saint Sebastian, to give the painting a sense of, again, this kind of cover up of religiosity. And when Basile was asked why painting only men, his response was that females were horribly difficult to paint. And another artist that specializes in sensual paintings of nude young males is Henry Scott Tuke. And it's fascinating, I've researched this artist for a long time, that his paintings didn't cause a scandal because he presented nudity as an everyday activity. And in fact, his paintings provided an idealized image of the healthy English young man. Also, maybe the most important factor is that he showed his love for young nude males in a sensual, not sexual way. He never showed their genitals. And this is a very famous lithograph by the ostensibly heterosexual George Bellows. And Bellows shows one of the gay encounters that he witnessed at the bathhouses in New York City. And in this very famous image, he shows hiding in plain sight an erection hidden by a towel in one of his most famous lithographs. So now let's talk about wrestlers. So this idea of wrestlers to express same-sex desire is as old as the 3rd century AD, when there were sculptures already about it, and all the way to present times with this image by Carlos Almaraz from 1984. So it's this idea of aggression masking tenderness. I like this quote from Barbara Kruger, who said, "Men construct intricate rituals which allow them to touch the skin of other men." I think that summarizes what this code is about. And speaking of wrestlers, I want to talk about a very important painter, Francis Bacon, and a crucial painting in his career, Two Figures. He painted it in 1953 when homosexuality was punishable with up to 2 years in prison in Britain. And this painting captures the violent intimacy that existed between Bacon and his then lover, Peter Lacy. When we look at this painting, we feel that we are intruders in their private space, to the point that when this painting was first displayed at the gallery show, it had to be kind of hidden out of the way in case there was a police raid. The fact is that if Bacon had admitted that his painting was expressing his sexual desires, he could have been sent to jail. So when he was questioned about it, he was always evasive. He avoided any sexual connotations. And instead, he kind of beat around the bush and said, oh, these are wrestlers. This is a metaphor of post-war violence. Or he talked about how he was inspired by Michelangelo or by the wrestling photographs of Edward Muybridge. Again, all these were just cover-ups to give the painting a palatable face. So Bacon resisted biographies all his life, and he didn't acknowledge his homosexuality in public until he was in his 70s. And when he did, he said he disliked the term gay, and he preferred to be labeled queer. And this strategy worked. The critics accepted his cover-up, and they named him the most important artist of his generation. But this, to me, brings up a haunting question, which is, had Francis Bacon been openly gay from the beginning of his career, instead of in his 70s when he came out, would his triptych have sold for $158 million today? And my guess is no. The next chapter in this section is patriotic images. So this idea of patriotic and heroic as a basis for homoerotic images is as old as time. Here we see an engraving by Veneziano from the year 1517 with a soldier. This famous engraving by Polaiolo called The Battle of the Naked Man from 1470, and this painting called The Gladiator Combat. But I could be showing you hundreds of images of this patriotic cover-up for homoeroticism. But this brings me to Leonidas at Thermopylae by the painter Jacques-Louis David, which is one of the Louvre Museum's most iconic paintings, and is charged with homoerotic images hiding in plain sight, with critics and historians completely ignore, and they refuse to comment on. So David painted this image just a few years after the French Revolution legalized same-sex desire, which happened in 1791. And David uses nudity for many different reasons. First is a fact of ancient life, that's how they were, but also he uses it as a metaphor for civic virtue in France after the excesses of the monarchy. Remember what I mentioned before about this idea of the idealized male body as a symbol of virtue. But also, this painting has so many layers. It also reflects the homosocial bonds that existed between men at the time, when friendships between men and women were basically unheard of. And on a personal level, we don't know if David was gay or not, but what we know is that this painting reflects the emotionally charged male bonds that existed in his studio, where male pupils were constantly fighting to get David's attention and approval. So let me walk you through this painting and let's decode it together. So you remember how I talked about this idea of the small genitals as a symbol of virtue and rationality and moderation, which is what David subscribes to. However, he kind of adds a scabbard that is really attracting attention to the genitals. So there's no way to avoid it. Then we here see a soldier offering his wreath while he's checking out very clearly Leonidas' ass. You know, so in this painting, the idea of heroism coexists with homoeroticism. We also see a naked adolescent kissing a soldier, and this is once again echoing the idea of the mentorship between older and younger men during the ancient Greeks. And here we see a soldier gazing lovingly at Leonidas, just like students look up to David in his studio. And here in the last inset that I want to show you, we see a young man who is crowned with flowers next to Leonidas, who appears to be his young lover. He's very androgynous, which, as I explained, is nothing to do with queerness. It's all about this idea of the ideal beauty, the androgyny being the ideal beauty. But this homoeroticism is in patriotic ads is everywhere. I mean, I could do a whole presentation just on ads from World War II that were homoerotic. These are just three of them. We see this suggestive image of these naked soldiers in this bath towel ad, or this one by Chesterfield, or this is from China and Russia. So it's a common theme around the world, this idea of homoerotic patriotic ads. So now moving on to a different area of how to hide queer imagery in plain sight, the idea of Orientalist images. So there's a current of homoeroticism that runs through Islamic life and art. This is an example from 1627. So for centuries, there was this enduring fantasy in Europe about the gay life in the Middle East and North Africa. And this fantasy is something that both artists and travelers explored in homoerotic visuals like these two, which were accepted because of their exoticism. So here the exoticism of Orientalism is a cover-up for homoeroticism. Surrealism is also used very frequently as an excuse to show homoerotic images in plain sight. This is a famous painting by Salvador Dali. This one is by Jared French, who I'm going to be talking about later in the talk. And this is a photograph by George Platlines. He did many surrealist images, and I spoke about him in the talk about the double lives of queer artists. So let's talk about a fascinating subject, the idea of gender fluid images in art. This idea of gender fluidity is not new. We think that this just happened, but it's not. I mean, starting with many female images in the Sistine Chapel, which have a sexual ambiguity because Michelangelo used male models for them. And then I want to get your attention to this painting by Franz Hals from 1616 called Merrymakers at Shore Time. And this painting is really full of winks. So there's a group of male revelers surrounding what looks like a young woman in a fancy dress. But if you pay attention or a closer look like I did at an exhibition, you can clearly see that the central figure has an Adam's apple. He is in fact a young man, and the painter is surrounded him with very suggestive images. So the table is covered with sausages. There's an older man that is dangling a garland, which has even more sausages and broken eggs, which is a symbol for lost virginity, while another man is looking at him very seductively. So in 1616, we already have images of gender fluidity in art. And this painting, called Woman with a Feather in Her Hat, is a portrait of the Chevalier d'Eon, who had an extraordinary life. So he spent extraordinary amounts of money on dresses and accessories, but he continued to always wear a stubble. And he was named French ambassador in Russia in 1756. And there he attended the drag balls of the Empress Elizabeth. And in these drag balls, all the guests had to arrive in a dress, regardless of their gender. So after that, he was sent to London as a spy. And there, he went public as a cross-dresser. So in essence, he spent 49 years as a man and 33 years as a woman. And the last image I want to talk to you about in regards to gender fluidity is this is the central figure in one of Gauguin's most important paintings called Where Do We Come From? And this is what the native Hawaiians and Tahitians call a mahu. Mahu means in the middle, or what they call the fair gender people. So these mahus are people who are born with the sexual organs of a man, but usually from childhood, they start opting for femininity. And when they do, they are revered in their communities because of their mystical powers. And in an interesting anecdote, when Gauguin first arrived to Tahiti, he had shoulder-long hair. So the locals thought he was a mahu. And he didn't know what that was, but that caught his attention and started investigating. And he really became acquainted with many of them and incorporated them into many of his paintings, including this one. Okay, so that's that for gender fluidity. So let's talk about public murals. How many of them have homoerotic images. I've explained how Michelangelo struggled his whole life with a conflict between his deep sense of religion and his homosexuality. So he accepted the commission to paint the Sistine Chapel, so the church saved his soul. But he couldn't avoid expressing his same-sex desire in his work. For instance, in this scene in the Sistine Chapel that shows not one, not two, but three male couples kissing. This is a close-up of one of them. So starting with Michelangelo, this idea of the homoerotic murals start thriving in the Renaissance, and they continue until today. This is an example for a mural you can see in Switzerland, and this beautiful one by Pontormo, you can see it in Florence at the Medici Villa. But today I want to talk to you about an American mural that by Jared French called Mealtime with the Early Coal Miners that he did in 1935 for the Plymouth Post Office in Pennsylvania. And I want to talk to you about for a second about the WPA, which you may have heard of. The Works Progress Administration was an American agency that was established in 1935 to employ millions of job seekers to carry out public works projects. And the mandate was for murals that promoted outdoor activities, masculinity, workers, athleticism, all these values. So queer artists took advantage of this mandate to portray homoerotic images in these murals. And this is when, this is what Jared French did. In this mural, he makes these hypermasculine images that made homoerotic desire visible to gay men while remaining invisible to the general audience. It's kind of a dance that he plays, and he got away with it. In fact, this figure, which you can barely see, is a young naked male, and this is the only frontal nude that exists in a post office in the United States. And Jared French got away with it because when he sent a photo of the image for approval to the WPA, this image was barely visible. So he really fooled the administration. Okay, so I just finished the first section, which is hiding images in plain sight. Now I'm going to talk about a different way to portray homoerotic desire, and this is using secret gay codes in the work. And I'm going to talk about how there are secret gay codes in homoerotic male nudes, in disguised gay scenes, in metaphorical images, to portray a secret love, and to overcome repression. So secret codes become really handy when gay artists want to portray homoerotic male nudes. So this painting, called The Swimming Hole by Thomas Eakins, is one of America's most beloved paintings, and is universally regarded as a visual poem to male youth in an idyllic setting. But it's also considered the first contribution to male homoeroticism in US art. So the sexuality of Thomas Eakins is hotly debated to this day. So he took many homoerotic photographs of male nudes of his students, of himself, and of his handsome studio partner called Samuel Murray, whom he went with in camping trips for weeks, even after Eakins got married, and whom, according to all, all accounts, Murray was Eakins' the most important relationship in his life. And if you're looking for answers about Eakins' sexuality in his letters, unfortunately, you're out of luck. He wrote to his parents, Eakins, "A female body is the most beautiful thing in the world, except for a naked man." So let me talk more about this painting. So Eakins painted it as a commission. And to do it, he engaged several of his students to pose nude outdoors, reflecting this idea of the classicism, the idea of fitness, camaraderie, recreating Plato's Academy. However, he broke with many conventions. First, he showed male nudity for its own sake, nudity with no narrative justification. He used identifiable young men and a recognizable local setting right outside of Philadelphia. But to squash any pushback to this painting, which is obviously very disruptive, what does he do? So he loads it with codes to give it a patina of respectability. So let me walk you through them. So you see how the models, the way they are positioned, it looks like it's one figure in movement, in a way implying that this is like an academic exercise. Then the youth on top is posing like the Renaissance statue of Donatello's David, and this one like the classical statue of the Dying Gaul, two very important statues. So what he's doing is using classicism, once again, as a cover-up for homoeroticism. But let's get deeper into this painting. What not many people know is that this painting is a coded tribute to a poem about loving young males by the revolutionary queer poet Walt Whitman. So in Whitman's seminal book, Leaves of Grass, in the section called Song of Myself, Whitman talks about, in one of his poems, about 28 young men bathed by the shore, dancing and laughing. Along the beach came the 29th bather. The beards of the young men glistened with wet. It ran from their long hair, etc., etc. So if you look carefully, you will find Eakins' self-portrait swimming towards the naked youth. So he is the 29th bather as described by Walt Whitman. So in spite of all these cover-ups and excuses, it didn't work. The patron who commissioned the painting from Eakins, when he received it, he rejected it. He wasn't very clear about why, but we can guess why. And from then on, all Eakins scholars start referring to him and his students as those Whitman fellows, a code for gay. And this was the first of the many scandals that ended with Eakins being expelled from the academy. And sadly, this painting remained in his studio and unsold until his death. But it's interesting that Eakins is not the only painter who created a coded tribute to the queer poet Walt Whitman. So in 1960, when the openly gay artist David Hockney was in art school in London, creating what he described as propaganda for homosexuality, he created this painting called Adhesiveness, which is in fact the first double portrait of his career. And the name Adhesiveness is how Walt Whitman refers to the intimacy between two men. So his tribute starts with the title, then with the iconic hat of Walt Whitman, but he takes this to the next level because Hockney in his painting uses the same codes used by Whitman in his diaries when he's describing his sexual encounters. So he didn't put their names in his diaries. So what Whitman did is instead of letters, he used their corresponding number in the alphabet. And that's what Hockney does in his painting. So let me explain. So here we see 48, fourth letter D, eighth letter H, D-H, David Hockney, 23, 23, W-W, Walt Whitman. So he's using the same codes that Whitman used in his diaries in this very cheeky tribute by David Hockney. So the next section is secret codes in disguised gay scenes. So one of my favorite painters, Paul Cadmus, in 1934, he created this painting called The Fleet's Inn. And it's a painting that is coded in satire, in which men and women are fighting for sailors' attentions. So this painting was commissioned by the government, and when it was finally displayed in Washington, it caused a national scandal, with a Navy officer saying in public that this painting represented a most disgraceful and sordid scene. But he didn't say why. And a cousin to the then President Roosevelt entered the corporate museum where the painting was displayed and walked out the door. if you don't mind muting the microphone, please. So a cousin to the then President Roosevelt entered the courtroom and walked out the door with the painting under his arm with no opposition. But it was too late. The next day, a photograph of the painting became front page scandal in every newspaper. Cadmus received life threats and he had to hide with his family until the scandal subsided. But what is fascinating is if you read the articles, they don't explain what was so scandalous about the painting. So what was all the fuss about? Well, the answer is that there was a coded sexual pickup in the painting. So red ties at the time were used by gay men to identify each other. Here we see one picking up a sailor. So critics never mentioned the gay subtext of the painting, and Cadmus used the fact that homosexuality was unspeakable to mock the Navy. And this painting made Cadmus a star in the art world, but unfortunately this painting remained out of sight until 1981. So the next section is metaphorical images used as a code to portray queer images in art. I haven't spoken about Leonardo da Vinci yet in my lectures, and in today's terms, we would describe Leonardo as an openly gay man. In his diaries, Leonardo described things like, "I went to the baths on Saturday to see naked men." And he was publicly accused of sodomy twice, but he avoided a sentence because one of the other accused men was very close to the Medici family, which was the one that ruled the city. And in Leonardo's sketches, we can see many sketchbooks of his assistant nude, and he named his assistant Salai, or the little devil. And Leonardo constantly complained about Salai being a liar and a thief, but he stayed with him all his life. It's interesting that Leonardo left the Mona Lisa to Salai in his will, and according to many historians, it's actually Salai who probably posed for the Mona Lisa. And in this drawing by Leonardo called Allegory of Pain and Pleasure, we see Leonardo and Salai back to back. And in this coded metaphor shows how, for Leonardo, pleasure is inseparable from pain. And this image leaves no doubt about the true nature of his relationship with Salai. So let's talk about lesbian artists. So prior to modern times, there were very few out lesbian artists. And a thread that joins most of them is that they were affluent. And because they were wealthy, they could afford being open about their sexuality. For instance, Tamara de Lempicka, who I already covered in one of my lectures, Jean Mammon, Leonor Feeney, Gluck, and Romaine Brooks. So just like their male counterparts, unable to express same-sex desire openly, many female artists use metaphorical codes in their art. For instance, the artist Ethel Sands, she wanted to portray her female lover, but she couldn't do it openly. So what does she do? She paints the couch where she spends her intimate time with her partner, something that I find very moving. And Tamara de Lempicka, who painted openly lesbian images, she also painted coded ones, like this one called Double 47. And 47 is a code for this is the street number where her favorite lesbian bar was located. And you remember how I spoke about Georgia O'Keeffe's intimate relationship with the artist Frida Kahlo. Today I'm going to talk about Georgia O'Keeffe's coded sexual paintings of flowers, but you notice how I added a question mark. Why is that? I'll explain. So Georgia O'Keeffe is best known for her large paintings of flowers. So this interpretation that O'Keeffe's flowers were coded representations of female genitalia was first proposed by her partner, Alfred Stieglitz, the photographer, in 1919 before they got married. So from then on, despite 6 decades of O'Keeffe completely denying this idea with statements such as the subject matter of a painting should never obscure its form and color, which are its real thematic content. To this day, this interpretation is a common assumption. O'Keeffe, in fact, was furious in the 70s when feminists embraced this interpretation of her work, because the feminists saw her work as empowering to women and a contrast to the tradition of female nudes that were painted by male artists. In response, she insisted that she wasn't a feminist or even a female painter. She was just a painter. And in an interesting case of how these interpretations evolve with time, in today's retrospectives, this sexual interpretation is questioned. That's why I put the question mark, because it was initiated by a male artist and consequently is seen as a biased male point of view. So it's up to you how today you see images like this. And staying with the idea of flowers, during her 4-year relationship with a florist, the lesbian artist Gluck, unable to paint her female partner openly, like I say, a florist, she painted instead her lover's favorite flowers. And when the relationship ended, she started painting dry flowers. Later, she felt strong enough to portray herself in public with her new partner, Nesta, in this iconic queer painting called Medallion from 1936. But many lesbian artists use metaphorical codes in their work. For instance, the photographer Ruth Bernard in this 1952 photograph, and Harmony Hammond, a present-day artist, they both use mirror imagery alluding to same-sex attraction in a coded, metaphorical way. That's what Agnes Martin also does in this image from 2003 of an abstract image. And then in this very famous portrait by the lesbian photographer Berenice Abbott, this called Portrait of Janet Flanner, which is an example of coded sexuality with the use of masks. I want to talk to you now about Rosa Bonheur, who was the most successful female artist of the 19th century, and is today considered a queer icon. She was famous for her painting of animals. She shunned all traditional feminine pursuits and ideals, and she declared openly that the only males she liked were the bulls that she painted. This is probably her most famous painting, called The Horse Fair, and 15 feet long, is one of the largest at the Metropolitan Museum. And to give you a sense of the importance of this painting, the Metropolitan Museum paid to acquire a third of the cost of building the museum. And Bonheur painted herself in the middle of the horse fair, dressed like a man, the only one without facial hair. So in this very famous photo of Bonheur, shows how she regularly dressed in men's trousers and smock. And she was once arrested by a policeman who saw her walking with short hair and with a male swagger. She got very upset and she asked the French government for, and she got a transvestite permit so she could dress in men's clothes, so she could be treated like a lad and work better with animals without being harassed. And I find this really powerful. So when she painted her self-portrait, she did it in a coded way. In El Cid, which is, like I said, a self-portrait, she created this image of herself as a male lion. free, brave, and rebellious like herself. And I want to talk about the AIDS crisis, because the AIDS crisis prompted a variety of artistic directions from queer artists, from the political, like David Wojnarowicz, to the activist, like Keith Haring, to representational, like Hugh Steers, and metaphorical, like the artist I want to talk about today, Felix Gonzalez Torres, who, if you don't know him, I encourage you to do some research on him, because he's an extraordinary artist. He's a Cuban artist who moved to the United States in 1979, and both him and his partner died of AIDS. And his philosophy as an artist was not to be confrontational or angry. He believed that the most successful of all political moves were the ones that didn't look to be political at all. And his goal was to infiltrate the museums with his work, just like the AIDS virus infiltrated him, which I find a very powerful statement. So how did he do that? So he did that, creating coded art with emotional visual metaphors, inviting viewers to participate in the experience, calling attention to the spiritual impact of AIDS. And a really moving of that is this installation called Untitled, Portrait of Ross in LA, created the year that his partner died in 1991. So this installation features a pile of colorful candy in the exact weight of his partner, 175 pounds. So the viewer at the museum is encouraged to eat the candies. So the installation starts disappearing slowly, just like his partner did. So with that, Gonzalez Torres is alluding to society's silent participation in the death of gay men and women during the AIDS epidemic. But what is so beautiful about it is that as the installation disappears, it gets constantly replenished by the museum. So in fact, he's giving his partner eternal life. I still get goosebumps. And I still remember how I burst in tears when I read the explanation about this installation, because it really showed me the transformational power of art. And this is one of the reasons why Gonzalez Torres' work was much better received than openly gay art, and how he became one of the most influential artists of the 90s all the way until today. So let's talk about codes to portray a secret love. So in the year 1534, after Michelangelo met and fell in love with the handsome, intelligent Tommaso de' Cavalieri, Michelangelo sculpted this statue called Victory, which shows Michelangelo's self-portrait as an old man trampled by a handsome, young, naked man, probably Tommaso de' Cavalieri. So this is a coded metaphor of Michelangelo's unfulfilled relationship with Tommaso, who was heterosexual. And I will talk about an artist that I adore, that unfortunately is not as famous as he should be, is Martin Hartley. And he lived in the US, he was queer, and finding our country very repressive, he moved to Berlin, which at the time was the most liberal city in the world. And he arrived right before World War I. And he immediately fell in love with the country, the people, and the military paraphernalia. And he started expressing his sexual fascination for these soldiers in a coded way in this painting called The Warriors, which when you see it in person, you completely capture the sexual energy in it. But then something crucial happens in his life. He meets and falls in love with a young Prussian soldier called Karl von Freiberg. And in this is how Hartley describes von Freiberg. 6 feet of splendor and lasting manhood, made of youthful and simple desire. No one is more beloved and necessary to the well-being of the world. Our spiritual marriage is worthy of worship. Such a beautiful, beautiful explanation. And what is really sad is that soon after, von Freiberg is sent to World War I, and he dies. And Marston Hartley is completely overwhelmed with grief, but he cannot express it openly. Why? Because A, is a homosexual relationship, and B, he is a German soldier, the enemy. So what does he do? So he creates 12 life-size abstract paintings that express his love for Carl von Freiburg in a coded way. And these groundbreaking paintings, a memorial to Freiburg that he created in less than a month, revolutionized abstract art. So let me decode this for you because I find this an extraordinary example. So Marston Hartley identifies with codes all of Carl von Freiburg's attributes as a soldier, mid-body up, except his likeness. So in fact, this painting is kind of like an anthropomorphic image of Carl, like a coffin with flags, which allow him to express his grief without being punished. But let's get even closer to it. The black background is a symbol of mourning. He paints a halo around the helmet because Hartley considered Carl to be a saint. This was the symbol of Carl's Queen's Elizabeth Regiment, Carl's horse spear, Carl's initials, the Iron Cross that Carl received, placed where his heart would have been in the painting, chess, which was Carl's favorite game, and 24. His age when he died. So when you see this painting in person, like I actually saw here in Los Angeles in a retrospective of Marston Hartley, and you understand what's behind them, it is so overwhelmingly emotional. I can even tell you. And I'm really emotional just talking about it. So during his lifetime, Hartley never disclosed his homosexuality, or the fact that his relationship was Carl was the basis of these paintings. So not many people knew. And when he exhibited them for the first time in 1916 in New York, he was called a pro-German traitor. And in spite of the fact that, as you can see, Hartley's homosexuality is crucial to his work, this fact was not publicly addressed in an exhibition until the Whitney retrospective in 1980. So now let's talk about one of my favorite artists, also Grant Wood. And the homosexuality of Grant Wood, creator of the iconic American Gothic, was an open secret in his small town of Cedar Rapids in Iowa. So Grant Wood kept his sexual orientation masked behind this persona of a farmer. He wore overalls in interviews and photos. And in interviews, he declared things like, oh, all my best ideas, I got them when I was milking a cow, which of course it wasn't true, but it sounded good. And he was forced to stay in the closet by the art group he belonged to, the Regionalists, because the leader of the group, Thomas Benton, despised gay artists. But also, Grant Wood's sister, Nan, who posed for the female character in American Gothic, was wildly homophobic. So this tension is at the core of American Gothic, the painting that made him a star in the art world. In this painting, we see Nan watching Grant Wood's alter ego, his dentist, like a hawk. And for a man, Grant Wood, with a secret, this sudden celebrity in 1930 with this painting became a huge issue. The articles that came out about him started describing him as a shy bachelor with a high-pitched voice who maintained a discreet silence about marriage and who lived with his mother. They were hinting way too obviously about his homosexuality. And this brings us to later, he did a series of lithographs, and this particular one called Sultry Night, in which he shows a frontal male nude next to a phallic trough, caused a huge scandal to the point that the post office banned it for distribution on the mail. So this obviously wakens Grant Wood up, and he realizes that he's not able to express his homosexuality openly. So what does he do? He shifts gears and starts creating coded homoerotic images. For instance, spring turning. So look at it for a second. So, this apparently bucolic, innocent farmlandscape, what really is a painting of a male farmer's buttocks, including the back pockets of his overalls. Extraordinary, particularly when you see it in person. And Grant Wood painted this very important portrait, Arnold Comes of Age, in 1930, the same year than American Gothic, when all these dangerous articles start hinting at his homosexuality. And both Gothic and Arnold Comes of Age share the same conflicted emotional tone. So in this painting, Grant Wood reveals his desire for Arnold Pyle, his studio assistant, who lived with Grant Wood, Grant Wood's mother, and Grant Wood's sister in a very close environment. I would have loved to be a fly on the wall in that household to see what was going on. And Arnold had just turned 21 when Wood painted this portrait as a birthday gift for him. And he portrays him as good-looking, tall, strong, well-built, dark hair, and heterosexual. Exactly the type of man that Grant Wood kept falling in love with time and time again throughout his life. And on the surface, this appears to be another one of Wood's traditional depictions of rural American life, but let's look at it closely. First of all, this painting is very much invested with melancholy. There's a theme of couples in the painting. Two men, two trees, two haystacks, two bushes, alluding to his longing for Arnold Pyle. But there's more. You see the two nude young men skinny dipping in the corner of the portrait. One of them has his buttocks extended backwards, which is a clearly sexual pose. And this image really evokes what we usually see in the history of art of Adam and Eve expelled from paradise because of the original sin. But in his painting, it's really Adam and Adam expelled from Eden for indulging in the sin of homosexuality. And to the left, we see how a butterfly has landed on Arnold's sleeve. This idea of the butterfly, it allows the traditional interpretation of Arnold transforming from a young man into a mature man. But there are other layers. The butterfly tea shop was their favorite hangout in town, where they spend hours and hours together. And think about it. The butterfly has the power to camouflage its beauty from, all their predators, which is what Grant Wood, as a gay man, had to do at the time. And it's hard to see, but the belt that was probably also a gift from Grant Wood to Arnold has Arnold's initials, AP, for Arnold Pyle, and next to it, Grant Wood signed his name, which I believe he did it so at least in this painting, they could be together forever. And Nan, Grant Wood's sister, survived her brother for nearly 5 decades. She didn't die until 1990, milking the fact that she had posed for American Gothic. She spent her life spreading lies about her brother's supposed female lovers and suing anyone who tried to mention his the sexuality. And she burned all his letters, claiming that, quote, they were unimportant. And Grant Wood's sister's homophobia is a key reason why Grant Wood's homosexuality was never discussed publicly and has been avoided in exhibitions until the Whitney retrospective 3 years ago, which finally addressed it in 2018. In fact, the catalog of the exhibition says that homosexuality is the code that unlocks the truth to Grant Wood's art. And if you're interested in Grant Wood, this month, the next issue of the Gay and Lesbian Review has a feature story that I wrote about him, in which I talk about all aspects of his life, and I think you're going to find it fascinating. And the last section is secret codes to overcome repression. So I'm sure we all know that the McCarthy era targeted communists, but a lesser known fact is that it also targeted, in greater numbers, homosexuals, who were considered a threat to national security because they could be blackmailed. In 1953, President Eisenhower banned gays from working in the government. At this time, admitting you were a homosexual would give you 15 years to life in prison. So if you're an artist, what happens? It immediately forces you to abandon same-sex imagery and figurative art altogether. And this is when abstract expressionism arises and changes the course of art history, with artists like Jackson Pollock creating bold, massive, macho paintings. But I want to share with you a painting by a queer artist called George Stucker. And in this painting called The Subway, he depicts in a coded way the fear, the anxiety, the shame that gay men and women suffered during the McCarthy era, like a modern day purgatory. And now the last artist I want to talk to you about is Jasper Jones, who just turned 91 years old. He's probably the most important American living artist. And he always said in interviews that he didn't want his work to expose his feelings. And he had a 7-year relationship with Robert Rauschenberg, 1954 to 1961, which was crucial for his development as an artist. But that relationship has been discussed really for the first time openly and clearly around the retrospective of Jasper Jones that just opened in New York and Philadelphia. I'm talking about 2021. 4 years ago, the retrospective of Robert Rauschenberg at New York's MoMA Museum described them as friends. And I want to talk to you about two important pieces in Jasper Jones' career. One, Target with Plaster Cast, created at the beginning of his relationship with Rauschenberg, and the other one, Painted with Two Balls, at the end of the relationship. And both pieces reflect the repression of the McCarthy era in a coded way. So let's start with Target with Plaster Casts. This piece shows 9 body parts: the mouth, the nipple, the penis, etc. So these parts represent many of the desires for which gay men would have been imprisoned during the McCarthy era. And each cubicle has a little door which allows it to close, so each body part could be closed, becoming a closet. So Jasper Jones is using as an artist the same tactics used by gay men during the McCarthy era to escape detention: masks, codes, dissimulation, closet. Also, he paints a target because as a gay man, he feels he's the target of the repression of the McCarthy era, like a modern day St. Sebastian. And it's interesting that Jasper Jones didn't sell this painting to the Museum of Modern Art of New York because MoMA wanted to display the cubicle with the penis closed. And this one, Painted with Two Balls from 1960, what he's showing in a coded way is how his sexuality is repressed by the macho posturing of abstract expressionism and artists like Jackson Pollock. And when you see it in person, you can't but feel the art world squashing his sexuality. So Jasper Jones, he articulates the desire of the closeted man and subverts abstract expressionism, and in doing so, he becomes a bridge between abstract expressionism and pop. That's why he's such an important artist. And just to close the lecture, now that you heard of this, I hope you share with me the belief that it's very important these gay codes don't get forgotten and erased from history or from our collective memory. And now I leave you with this quote by the artist Enrique Martinez Celaya, who I believe summarizes what I spoke about today, which is art is as much about what is not there as about what is there. The greatness of a work of art depends more in what it holds back than in what it shows. So that's it for me. I hope it wasn't too much. And now it's time for any questions you may have.
Yeah,
first we should do some big round of applause because I'm, again, so not only grateful for the content, but just really it was super eye-opening. So I just want to say thank you very much first and foremost, and thank you for all the work that you did.